I think you have such a fascinating life story, and in order to understand this conversation, I think it might be a good idea to explore a little bit about how come you ended up writing your latest book, The Shadows at Work, and I would imagine that your life story has been a pretty big part of ending up where you are today.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So I think the Shadows at Work book is about looking at our dark side, as it were. Dark as not in negative, but more hidden. And I think there were three main reasons I chose to write about this topic. One is intensely personal. So I grew up in the United Kingdom and as a really a child of a strong Catholic family. And one would say being a Catholic is like a PhD in guilt and shame, but
Mm,
also forgiveness and compassion. And I've always wrestled with that. Why do I do what I don't want to do? You know, and what is the disconnect between living, let's say, a good and ethical life and always failing to live up to that measure?
mm,
And exploration for me ended up as training for the priesthood. So I had the opportunity to work with a wide variety of people from in an Alzheimer's disease unit to a mental prison to a school in the East End of Glasgow, Scotland. And it really gave me a broader view of humanity rather than just working with your own culture or within your own subgroup. It wasn't a vocation I decided to continue, so I actually went to university, and I was sponsored by the prison service. So whereas my friends had projects in the summer internships in consulting companies and investment banks, I worked in a young offenders prison with boys who were 15 years old, and they'd been sentenced for 14 years for murder, robbery, and rape. And it was an interesting experience for me because where we tend to have, very clear or maybe fixed ideas about what's a good person and what's a bad person. And these clearly the heinous crimes would be considered very negative, obviously.
mm,
But the young boys, I found most were illiterate. They didn't know how to read or write.
mm,
Most of them had no fathers. They grew up without that kind of guidance or role modeling. The majority of them had children, and they didn't even know how to do basic things like shave, for example. So
mm.
it took away my, let's say, preconceived ideas around what does it take to be a good human being, showed me the power of context and
Yeah.
environment
I would
shaping.
imagine that it starts shaping your mind to looking into the systems a lot behind, rather than just placing blame on individuals.
And many of them came from minority communities, from deprived backgrounds. I would say there were very few from privileged
Mm,
backgrounds in the prison service. So this was part of the context. On the professional side, I've spent the last 30 years working as a consultant, working with different organizations, and also coaching senior leaders. And I always became fascinated by the question: why do some people derail,
mm,
and why are some people successful in their role? And although we see, examples of derailment that's quite spectacular, normally, for example, you saw a recent case with the astronomer's CEO at the Coldplay concert shown to have an affair, or you see
mm,
senior leaders, let's say at BP, also losing their jobs because of behavioural
mm.
bribery or some form of misadventure. But why is it that they do this? But it's not just focusing on the senior leader as almost like the example that's not the common example. Gartner, in their research, showed that between 50 to 70% of leaders derail within the first 18 months. So why is
What's the
that?
definition of derailment when you speak about
Uh,
it?
you don't succeed in their role. You don't
Okay.
succeed in your role. And, one questions why. Obviously, there's multiple factors. So, for example, people are recruited into their role based on prior success
Mm,
at managing a job, but not necessarily on potential to do a new and more complex role. Sometimes they're identified as stars because they perform well, but much of that star behavior came because of their relationship with their team, for example, that allowed them to produce. And without the team as context, they no longer perform because they don't have those networks in place, but also because there are other psychological factors that I explore in the shadow book. But I'll go into them in more detail just to
mm.
just to co- come back to the second reason was, yes, about the derailment, but also around toxic cultures. Why do some organizations and corporations fail? So we've
Mm.
seen big examples of that, for example, in Boeing, where 346 lives were lost.
Mm.
But we've also seen it when most of us leave organizations because of toxic managers and leaders, but also the environment that we experience is
Yeah, that's the
toxic.
primary reason for leaving, as far as I understand the statistics.
Yes, exactly. And the third broad reason is around the societal relevance. There are two commentators, Edmund Lau and Matt Klein, and they wrote an article called Dark Mode Shift. And in the article, they argue that we're sort of living in a dark mode. Imagine your phone mobile goes into dark mode, it's black. They argue that we were progressing, we're making progress on climate, on different agreements, maybe cooperation at less, but now we're moving to more polarization, and we seem to be moving backward on a lot of progress that we made in the past decade or so. So in this dark mode, we're seeing almost like a more visceral anxiety and potentially, more opportunity for distraction. I think there's something called the doomsday clock, and we're literally seconds now from total destruction. And I talk about in the book, I begin with a line from a composer. His name was Michael Tippett, and he died at the age of 93 in 1998. And he wrote a libretto, like an opera, and it was the time of the World War II, and it particularly in the aftermath of Kristallnacht, which was a night of violence
Mm.
that started in Leipzig, Germany, on the assassination of a German soldier in Paris, an ambassador actually. And in the uh, line, he talks about, he said this, he said, "I would know my shadow and my light, so would I at last be whole."
Yeah.
And what he was discovering is that he was very politically active. He was a protest against the war. He was in Wormwood Scrubs prison in the UK because he didn't join the forces. And he discovered political activism isn't enough. We need to be able to face what is it within ourselves that we're projecting outwards. Why are we scapegoating others? That causes conflict and causes the toxic cultures and the toxic society that we're living in. So it's not just the personal, it's also the organizational, and it's also the societal. So the short answer is I wrote the book really, and to address all three elements, and I think
Mm.
they're all interrelated rather than separate.
Two things that pops up into my mind. In periods of increased external stressors, as I think we experience in our society right now, there's a tendency of the human brain to want to find dichotomies where there aren't necessary dichotomies. And I think shadow work is interesting because it kind of forces a false sense of a dichotomy, right? And back to your quote, I would want to know, what was the quote? Both my light and dark side, so I can
I
finally.
would know my shadow and my light, so would I at last be whole.
Yeah, and that speaks about integration, right?
Mm,
It's not about hiding the dark sides, because then I'm not whole. And I think the society that at least I grew up in puts a premium on the light side, and
mm.
everything else must be hidden.
Part of it is, there's a lot written on toxic
Yeah.
positivity. And, we live in a culture almost like of emotional labor, where in some professions, staff are paid to be polite, paid to smile.
Mm.
There's a Barbara Enright, the social, she wrote "Smile or Die."
Yeah.
There's a whole, and there's the huge cost because her research showed the people who did that lose touch of their own emotions and the capacities to feel, and they result in burnout, for example, and other mental health issues. So yes, I wanted to maybe address, what is that balance there, and we tend to over-index on one side. So I think with useful methodologies like appreciative inquiry, positive psychology, they're extremely helpful, but if we over-index them or take them only as our leadership style or our position, then I think it can become unhealthy.
Mm.
When I look the shadow. It sounds an obtuse concept, and a cursory look on Google will bring up things like inner child and almost like new age literature, which isn't helpful really for leaders, and particularly in thinking about the shadow. So where the main idea came from was mostly as a metaphor or an archetype, but it came from the psychologist Carl Jung,
Yeah.
who described it almost like a repository of all of the feelings, emotions that were not safe to be expressed. Normally in early childhood or development stages, such as messages that were given to us by our parents, child givers, by our teachers, but also by society. So a metaphor that's often used is of we were born as almost like babies in a palace. We could your child. You've got two children. And they don't when they're they don't shut off their emotions. They cry, they scream, they poop,
Yeah.
they laugh. And imagine you're born into a palace with many rooms, hundreds of rooms, and then over time, we learned, it wasn't safe to express this opinion. We shouldn't cry, so we shut off, maybe a room, and then we learned it's not okay to express anger. It should always be, polite and deferential. Close another room, and over time, those rooms become wings. Those wings become larger clusters, and in the end, we're left with like what used to be a palace with 100 rooms. We're left with two or three rooms, our
Mm.
two-bedroom, even like a studio. So there's a lots of us that isn't we're not consciously aware of, but that's still present. So his idea was the shadows is always present. It's not past. William Faulkner, the American essayist, he said the past is never dead. It's not
Mm.
even past. So there's this idea that it still influences us in the present. So, for example, we might have been told, you might say to a child, don't be selfish, share the toys with your brother or your sister. So we learn, it's not okay to protect what was ours. We need to share it. We need to give it away. We need to not be selfish. But that message can be internalized, normally as a transgression. So as adults or as leaders, we might find that we find hard to say no. Maybe we don't have boundaries. Maybe we're too much into people pleasing. Maybe we avoid conflict. But there are repercussions of how we live our lives. Now, in the psychological lens in the book, I look through most of the common ones, such as projection, defenses, and derailers, but as more the psychological side. But what I wanted to do was not only focus on psychology, which is one lens, but to take into the account that we're embodied beings, we're physiological, biological.
Absolutely.
Um, yeah, and the shadow also shows up there. It
Mm.
shows up in, I look at the work of Robert Sapolsky, who wrote Determined and Behave. And as a neurobiologist, his research shows that, our hormones, our DNA, our cultural heritage, all levels of sleep
Mm.
can all impact on our behavior and almost lead to toxic behavior and toxic outcomes. So when we're looking at the shadow, we can't separate our mind from our biology. We need to look at both what is happening in our physiology, and that might encourage toxic behavior. And just shortly, the last two lenses, maybe we can explore them further in our conversation, are looking at the systemic lens. So rather than just focusing on the idea of the individual or the leader, and often they're scapegoating of the bad leader, the bad apple, we just need to change the bad leader and everything will be okay. We
Mm.
need to see the shadow there's a collective shadow. So if we think simply of the shadow as the me that I don't see, there's a collective shadow, which is the we that we don't see. And this is the culture of an organization, and how might processes be creating outcomes that are negative or toxic for an organization. And the last lens was the spiritual lens, or the lens of meaning. So often shadows occur, and it can seem like we're in the dark. Using the dark as a metaphor can be quite painful. Periods of, let's say, will we find ourselves in self-sabotage? Will we find ourselves in addiction? Will we find ourselves doing behaviors that we're not making progress, and we feel a sense of what's happening in my life. Things are falling apart. But darkness and almost dissatisfaction can also be a space of transformation. So I use the metaphor night and day, both are equal, yet we
Mm.
tend to if someone's in the dark, they're in the not knowing it's negative. You should be, somebody in the light. But actually, all transformation, all growth happens in the dark. Think about the seed in
Yeah,
the
it's
earth.
very interesting. Like almost, I start to wonder if this is an intensely Western phenomenon from the Enlightenment period, we aim to serve the light in a sense, but in other cultures you have the yin and the yang, and they are intensely intertwined, right? Do you find
Yeah,
that as
you're
well? You've traveled all over the world. Is this more a prevalent way of thinking in the West?
Yeah, I think every culture has its own, shadows. For example, in Japan, culturally, like women are not, it's culturally inappropriate to laugh, so you always find people
You cover
covering
them
their
up.
mouth.
Yeah.
And then in other cultures, sexuality might be suppressed, or other
Mm,
so every culture has it. But I think, to your point, in Taoist philosophy. Both there isn't this Aristotelian split between good and bad, and flesh and matter, and that both are seen as intrinsically valuable.
mm,
And there's a more holism rather than fractured or separate thinking. So I think there is something, and for sure that culture shapes, and religion and belief shape our attitude to shadows. But equally, in the Western tradition, there's a lot of mystics like Meister Eckhart and John of the Cross that talk about the dark night of the soul, that do see shadow as something productive and of value. I just think that we need to reclaim that as leaders and to acknowledge that. And that comes into questions of meaning, questions of purpose. And they particularly arise at midlife, between the ages of 45 and 55. We tend to come with questions such as a sense of restlessness,
mm,
maybe a sense of regret, where we've made choices early in our career, let's say for prestige or for security, but that might have denied some things that we felt we were not able to fully express in the present and that we're
mm.
missing. So, this idea of that lens is also critical in understanding the shadow, not just through their biology or through systemic or psychology.
Yeah, and I would imagine that these different lenses are deeply intertwined as well. Do
Yeah,
you find that, so if we take the subgroup leaders, because everybody will carry their shadows, but do you
yes.
find that there are certain shadows that are more prevalent amongst that specific group leaders?
Mm. A common one is narcissism and
Mm,
entitlement. I think I read some research that showed levels of narcissism are multiple times higher, and
mm,
also in terms of psychopathy. Now that's debatable. I've had conversations that that there's no really accurate way of measuring it. People who are psychopaths don't take claims, but so and often it was almost like in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, leaders were blamed rather
mm,
than seeing systemic issues that gave rise to crisis. But I do think that as we get more senior in organizations, like many of the listeners here on the podcast, we do grow in power, and that can lead to a sense of entitlement, where there is a correlation between power and entitlement, and also a lack of feedback, really. So people are less able
mm.
to
Yeah.
give back to those in power, and we're less able to receive it because of that difference in status. So I think that one of the blind spots is certainly this idea of entitlement, and certainly this idea of narcissism that can be fed by that. So it's always a paradox.
Mm,
There's the paradox is that those who are most suited to power don't seek it, and those who
mm.
are least seek it and then quickly derail. So it's how do we understand our own attitudes to power, and also how is it mixed with some of the other elements that we talk about that lead to toxic behavior.
I would imagine, since you do so much consulting also to organizations, that there are systems to put in place to kind of decrease the risk of derailment. What are those systems?
Yeah, I think the main one is probably for human resources in terms of who do they promote
Mm,
and why. So there's a lot of research that shows that we promote very poorly, and we promote based on overconfidence rather than on capability. It happens particularly on a gender basis. So there's a good piece of article, actually, it's the most read HBR article by a colleague, Thomas Chimarako Music. He wrote an article called "Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders?" And in his research, it shows that it's because we judge overconfidence for competence,
Hmm.
and that's partly down to what we conflate, such as charisma, talking time with ability, and that's clearly been challenged, and they're not causal. So part of it is improving our processes systemically, how we select, how we
Hmm.
develop, and who we put in positions of power. Second is accountability. Often those in positions where they're bringing value to the organization, even if they might have ethical drift. Let's say they are
Yeah.
making bad decisions, doing things wrong. They're not held accountable
Yeah,
because
that's one of
they
the
have.
most difficult things to deal with as a company almost when you have that kind of star performer from an individualistic perspective, but that doesn't create a culture around him or her that fundamentally scales for the company. And it's very, very difficult because you're kind of forced into this short term, long term game. It's maybe you can't really afford if it's your star salesperson, for example, and that person actually brings in 70% of the company revenue if you're a small company. Can we afford to let him or her go, or like it's a difficult question for companies.
Yeah, I think there's a woman called Susan Fowler who wrote an article about her strange year in Uber,
Okay.
and she talked about how her line manager, made sexually inappropriate comments or
Yeah.
messages to her, and when she raised it, human resources offered her the opportunity to move
Mm.
rather than arrest the behavior. And I think that was, obviously that grew up into a huge movement. And what was important was it wasn't one isolated individual; it was across their organization. But you're right; he was a producer, and those in power were not held accountable. And I think that is probably one of the crises of leadership now. And how do we hold accountability, and what do we really stand for? So I gave you a specific example. I was coaching a senior leader in the city of London, a huge producer bringing in millions for the organization. But he would have a ferocious temper that he would dress down publicly junior members of the team.
There's always
So
junior people that gets the the dressing down, right?
equally his peers that he didn't
Okay.
feel were of his intellectual caliber, let's say, or his quality. So, he was ferocious in his attacks, but he was also a good producer. So there was an organizational dilemma. What do you do there? So what did they discovered is many of those people were leaving, the junior talents. They weren't staying. People didn't want to work with him. And in the end, it wasn't just it wasn't an issue that they could continue. So I worked with him over a period of several months, and it wasn't just anger management. For example, he had done anger management courses in the past, ironically, but these quick fixes and tools weren't able to help him. So one of the activities I did with him, and we drew a lifeline of his ups and downs from childhood to present.
Mm.
And what was interesting, he described his most conflictual workplace as 100 times better than his family environment.
Yeah.
So he said, his family environment, in the country he came from, his the shouting was so intense that it made like the most terrible workplace seem like heaven.
Mm.
And it wasn't an accident that the way that he orientated himself around groups and around individuals was from what was imprinted in him and his relationship to anger, because anger is, something that we're already taught about. Nobody goes to a 101 class on anger as a senior executive or even in any stage of our career. It's almost like, what is our relation to anger? Is it fused? Is it part of identity? Is it foreign? We don't even acknowledge it. What's anger? I
Exactly.
don't. Is it, so it's an interesting, so for him and the work we did was exploring what is his relationship and how can he develop a healthier way. And involved depth work, but often organizations don't do that. They either, ignore or
Mm.
they punish
I'll let go.
and let go. So I think part of being a good leader, to your point, it's not about fully revealing all your hidden aspects. That's not what authenticity is either. It's not, but what it is, it's being aware of it and being able then not to be acting out unconsciously on other people or derailing your own career,
Mm.
leading much more consciously, much more wisely and appropriately. So that's the I'd say one of the another key thing. Most organizations do not provide any support to
How do
their
you think
leadership.
about this from an organizational perspective? Because doing shadow work is I would imagine a you have to go quite deep. It's not something that you can do in a 1 hour webinar. Takes time, it takes courage, but it's
Yeah.
also difficult as a consequence to say we as an organization force all our leaders to go that deep, right? How do you think about this kind of tension that it's an individual responsibility, but we deal with the results as an organization?
You're right. I think you have to look at the cost of ignoring the shadow for an organization. So, the cost is very real. In the Boeing example, where they had the MAX disasters, was the cost was the loss of 346 lives
Mm,
because senior leadership weren't able to acknowledge their part in driving the culture that emphasized speed
mm,
and over safety and quality. And so, in so doing, scapegoated, blamed. First, they blamed the pilots, then they blamed the engineers, and and they ignored or they persecuted the whistleblower. So it's often, the cost is huge to getting it wrong. The personal cost is huge. Look at the famous examples of CEOs and senior leaders that have lost their jobs and left their organizations in some sense of shame, damaging what would have been a healthy legacy. But the cost to the culture, if you work for a toxic manager, as you've rightly said, you're far less likely to stay. But
mm,
if you do, more likely to be disengaged, maybe quiet quitting, not performing. So the cost to the economy is in billions. So how do we acknowledge that? Now it's not easy. I think it's a wrong move to almost have working life, co-opt your personal life, and there are boundaries. Already work has taken over much of our personal lives. So, and in the fact that many of us work from home and we have hybrid relationships to work,
mm,
but I also think that it's probably an organization's duty to provide some support for those who want to do this exploration because it can help them become a better leader as a development rather than a performance tool. And I think it's not just individuals, there are systemic things organizations can do that has nothing to do with psychology. So one of my contacts now, acquaintances, is a professor at Lausanne, two professors, Guido Palazzo and Ulrich Hofbridge, and they wrote a book called The Dark Pattern that looks at, what are the systemic issues that cause derailment and toxic organizations, corporate failure. And they identified 9 such dark patterns, and these were from vague goals that encourage rule bending,
mm.
things like hyper competition. So, for example, in Uber and also in Theranos, a very other famous
Yeah.
company that resulted in thousands of false medical tests being
Mm,
given. They were told, you can't cooperate, you can't collaborate, you need to compete. This encouraged almost like a behavior that was toxic and led to destructive patterns. The third one is incentives. If you reward people with incentives that uh, cause them to behave badly and do things that are unethical, that's also another thing. So, an example of that is in Wells Fargo. They wanted each sales rep to open at least 8 accounts for each of the clients, and so they were opening accounts without even the client's knowledge and closing them so they could meet their targets. And so it's incentives drive this behavior. So there are many ways organizations can address the shadow. But what I would say is look at the four lenses. Don't just look at systems. You must look at the individual.
mm.
You have to look Is it a biological reason? What are you lionizing? What long working hours? Are you helping people develop their capacity, not just their productivity? And then how are you engaging in meaning? So I think taking that broader four lenses, I think, is helpful. But you're right. I also am cautious about over managing on their personal lives, but also not disappearing that either, because we're bringing
Mm.
ourselves to work, and ignoring that doesn't mean the impact goes away. It just means that it happens and can sort of happen unconsciously.
To make this even more practical, do you mind sharing some because I would imagine that you've done some pretty intense shadow work yourself. Can you share some of the kind of shadows that you found, and then how have you worked on integrating them into your both professional life, your personal life?
Yeah, so I think in my early career, I remember one time my manager saying to a colleague of mine, he was a new colleague, that I'm really glad you're here. And inside, I felt a sense of pain. Why is he saying, I'm really glad you're here to my colleague, but not to me?
Hmm.
And
The jealous
we can
child came forward.
recognize its shadow when our reaction is disproportionate to the situation and somebody may have acted in a different way. So for me, I felt, no, what's going on here? I became curious. So the first part of shadow being very practical, and is bringing curiosity where you feel a sense of defensiveness or sense of hurt, and inquiring, what could this be?
It's
And
almost
so
a
for me,
practice as well to kind of just
yeah,
notice that this is probably a disproportionate reaction.
yes, it is. Yeah, it's recognizing, asking yourself,
Yeah.
"Wow, why is this bringing up so much friction in me?" So for me, it was, why am I reacting to a colleague in
Mm,
this way? A sense of jealousy, a sense of competition. And I'm the eldest of three, and I have a brother who's 1 year younger than me. And in my relationship with my brother, my parent told me I was always competitive. I felt he had displaced me or replaced me.
mm,
And so I had to be the high achiever. I had to be the one who would almost win their affection and attention. And that had a consequence. It had a consequence. How do I relate to my brother? Am I
mm,
caring or competitive? Now, it might sound silly, but that also carried over into my adult life. How am I collaborating or how am I competing?
mm,
So when I became more cognizant of this, I was less likely to push away my colleague and focus on my own achievements, but recognize, there's something here. It's
mm,
allowing me to soften. It's allowing me to not act out familiar, which is like rooted in the familial family
mm,
patterns, but giving me more choice at least, and enabling me to develop a healthier relationship with both the manager and my
mm,
colleague. That's a simple example. Another practical way that leaders can do this is to do assessments that not just focus on, we talked about the bright side, skills, they're positive on, but almost the dark side as well. So there's a very good psychometric tool called Hogan, which looks at the
yeah.
dark side. And essentially, this is based on the premise that often our shadow behavior is by strengths that are under pressure become derailers. So, for example, and my strength might be that I'm decisive. I make decisions very quickly, but under pressure, that decisiveness that's so healthy could become impulsiveness, and
Mm,
I'm not really thinking through, and it could lead into bad consequences. And I might have a strength of attention to detail, but under pressure, that might become micromanagement, or it
mm,
might be
mm,
paralysis. I don't want to make the wrong decision. So each of our strengths, in a way, under pressure, is when the shadow most comes up,
mm,
not when things are going fine, but when we're feeling a sense of. And most organizations and most leaders are listening to this probably spend a lot of their time under pressure. So that's when we need to be cognizant. And Hogan is a great tool for doing that. The other tool is recognizing when you're projecting, like I mentioned, the projection of my brother onto my colleague, but recognizing that what are you projecting onto others. So the common example is projections that are placed onto leaders. We almost have this idea that the leader or the manager must always be the hero, must save the organization, must always have clarity, direction,
Mm,
order. We put too many expectations onto leaders, and we're always disappointed because no person can live up to those consequences. And this comes from this ability to recognize that there'll always be a mixture. There'll always be this sense of complexity and nuance in every leader. It's not all good or all bad. There's how can we recognize the gray? And that's not just in seeing what we project onto leaders, but also what, as leaders, we internalize or we project onto others. So, research at INSEAD by John Piero Petroglieri and Mark Stein, it was called The Unwanted Self. And it shows that leaders who can't tolerate qualities in them that they don't want, they project onto competition, for example,
mm,
or other
okay.
leaders. So it's recognizing what are our people projecting onto us, but equally as leaders, what are we projecting onto others? We'll give back some of those projections by owning some of these qualities in ourselves. So if we're always told, for example, we should know, how might we have the courage to say, no, I don't know this, but this is what I think we should do as we
Mm,
go forward, or revealing more of our selves that break some of these conceptions or assumptions that are thrown on us. The way metaphor I like to think of it is a Santa Claus. You don't tell your 6-year-old that Santa doesn't exist. Over time, you might drop more clues,
mhm,
and when they're at 10 or they're 11, they know,
yeah.
you're Santa. But you let people understand in a rate that they can take
Mm,
what your own capabilities are, and so you're not, disappointing and leaving people floundering,
mm.
but you're not at the same time leaving people in magical thinking, so which can be equally as destructive. So being
There's an
able to
interesting like progression as well, going from so initially shadows, I would imagine for most people are pretty unknown. They're just ingrained in us from childhood. You have that
yes.
story as you told, don't take up so much space, so you become
Hmm.
self diminishing or whatever as a grown up.
Mm.
The first step I would imagine is realizing that I have this shadow, and then you can come to that realization in many ways. But I would imagine that most people see it as almost a character flaw. As you move along here, I would imagine that, and I would want to discuss concepts of shame, taboo, but almost desires as well. That it's not as one dimensional, the shadows, as just being the ugly parts of me. It might be the things that I'm really attracted to, but I'm trained that they are ugly, right?
Mm.
Do you agree with that?
Yes. Yeah, I do. Like, most shadows were formed because of shame. They
Yeah.
were formed because of transgression, where, we felt shame and it was not safe to feel that or express that. So, we form the shadow because shame, and we heal the shadow through relationship or developing an understanding of
Mm.
that it's safe to feel this, or it's safe to express this, or at least become aware of it so that we don't have to act it out.
If you've been listening to this podcast for some time, you know what I think about AI. I'm deeply excited about it, but I also see companies struggle with it. And you know that I think it's not primarily due to technical reasons. Compared to previous revolutions, let's call it the internet wave, part of why we struggled initially was that, well, the infrastructure wasn't built out. We didn't have online credit card payments and whatnot. But the difference with AI is that the infrastructure is already here. The technology is so much more capable than we actually use it right now. And the problem for most C-suites that I talk to, CEOs and senior managers, is that they know about the importance of AI, but they can't seem to get to that position where they truly understand how is AI making me fundamentally more competitive. I understand that it can save costs, hours here and there, increase some productivity number, but how do I distinguish myself on my market? Like the ones that truly survived the digitalization era wasn't a bookstore that got a website. It was the Amazons of the world. So where you truly find the transformation of what we do today and how can we unlock things, serve customers that we never could, do innovations that weren't ever before practical, that type of innovation. The primary problem that I see in all honesty, is that the C-suite, you don't really understand the technology. And not understanding the technology for the sake of understanding the technology, but for the sake of having a strategic discussion. So that's why I started Grail. I stand right smack dab in the middle of I understand the technology, I understand strategy and execution. And bringing these two together is what we do at Grail. So if you understand that this is something that needs to happen, then we should talk. Thing is, slots for this spring is already filling up. Grail has been in the works for some time, so I've already have engagement for the spring. But what I'm looking for is that one CEO in each market that truly wants to make a dent in the universe. So if you're that guy or that girl, please head over to Grail, that works, and let's talk.
Jung also had this idea of the golden shadow, meaning that it's not just the negative that is in our shadow. If we just take the shadow to be hidden, equally our gifts could be hidden. So, for example, let's imagine that you were quite exuberant as a child, but you were told, "Calm down. Don't be a show off." That sense of exuberance might be shut down. And you might find yourself in not being able to speak in public, keeping quiet when you have something valuable to say. So equally, our gifts can also be in the shadow. I gave the example of midlife earlier with the spiritual, but messages from society can put gifts in shadow.
Yeah, absolutely.
Examples,
It's so cultural, right? Your
yeah,
parents might have hated entrepreneurs for whatever reason, right? So they start talking to you that entrepreneurs is a risky choice. You shouldn't. You should go for stable employment.
a simple example is at school. I remember loving art, and
Mm.
loving painting. And I remember at 13, I needed to decide what will I study at GCSE. And I was told art isn't a real subject. You should do
Mm.
sciences, you do maths, geography. And I remember my art teacher being so upset, that I didn't follow this. And I too. And as an elder, okay, I'm rediscovering my love of art,
Mm.
midlife, rather than it, but it was a gift I enjoyed that enriched my life and taught
I
me
have the
much.
same relationship to dance. It was something that I I don't think it was anybody who explicitly told me that you shouldn't dance, but it's something that during growing up, I identified as not being a dancer, right? And now it's on a path to liberation of movement, and there's so many feelings of awe and wonder and being embodied with myself and being in the present moment that come of the kind of on the backside of allowing this. So I think
Mm,
just realizing that so much of what you perceive to be shadows aren't
mm.
some universal laws of nature that, that it's but you think that they are because it's so much taboo, so you don't even have a conscious relationship perhaps to it, and it's so scary to even lift up that box in your personal mind, so you just prefer keeping it tucked away, hidden away, right?
I think it's about listening to our desires
Mm,
and our longings as well, and not dismissing them too quickly.
mm,
And I gave the example of choosing career options early in our careers for prestige or for security.
mm,
I remember I've applied, I think, 4 times to be a school teacher, and I got accepted at Cambridge University in the UK. And I didn't choose teaching because I felt it was not rewarded in the UK as a profession, financially, and also politically. It was a bit of a punchbag
mm.
that the curriculums changed and the emphasis was on testing rather than on learning. But there's something in the longing, about
Yeah.
the desire to teach. And in the UK, you have a scheme, and it's gone global. It's called Teach First, which was for graduates who would do a year's teaching and then go into corporate life.
Mm,
But Lucy Kellaway at Financial Times, she started something called Now Teach, which is aimed at experienced professionals, who have decades working,
mm,
and then they transition to teaching and sharing what they do in school in inner city schools, for example, teaching maths or business.
mm.
So what I'm trying to say is not about trying to go back in time, but it's about looking at what is the maybe the longings or the desires that have been with us over a period of time, almost rediscovering, and how do we integrate them? How might we bring that
Yeah.
into our life now? So the simple example of dance that you gave or art that I gave, teaching might be, for me, it's not teaching in a school, but it might be teaching as I'm sharing with you, or writing a book, or
mm,
speaking about a topic I'm interested in. So there's ways that we discover our vital energy. But a big part of the shadow is it's not negative. You know, there's this concept of the wounded healer, and this idea that from what maybe was a point of shame or a point of woundedness in us
mm,
can actually be our greatest gift,
mm,
and can enable us to be more successful. Being able to lead from our wounds is unhelpful because we're still triggered, but we lead from our scars. So we've done the healing work, you know, we've
mm,
acknowledged this was something that happened in my life, and we all have that, you know, we all have the troughs as well as the high peaks.
mm,
But being able to not see that as negative, but in what way did that shape me, and in what way did that shape my leadership, could also be helpful, rather than keeping it hidden or suppressed or repressed, and using it as a force of good. So
mm.
that's another way that the shadow can manifest, and we can be in touch with our desire.
Which
And
of your four lenses did you find was most difficult to write about in the context of leadership? You mentioned sex, for example. That's why I thought of the question. I think there's something that most of us don't acknowledge in just our kind of core drives, and how that might impact energy at work, and mission, vision.
yeah,
But we don't really have a
I,
conscious relationship to it. And I thought two of your lenses was the biological one, which I think
yeah,
on the one hand is getting a little bit more attention nowadays, with understanding that high performance comes uh, best with a good sleep and a good physical body. I don't think that we're quite as aware of other stuff that you're talking about, as hormonal cycles, both for men and female.
mm,
I thought the spiritual lens and the idea of purpose was really interesting as well. Were those more
mm.
difficult to kind of fit in?
I think, but I think you've touched on, you know, because sex is often correlated with shame. And it's almost like we have no space for it in organizations. It's privatized. And, you know, apart from, let's say, an hour in our teenage years in sex education, or whatever it's called, personal social education now at schools, we're not taught how to deal with our sexual feelings, energy, how that might be correlated, or how that might express itself in the workforce, beyond a basic, let's say, ethics and compliance training that's online for most
Exactly.
organizations. It's almost like we're thought to be just minds at work.
Mm,
So a lot of the derailment happens around sexuality. You know, it's not seeing ourselves as physical, embodied beings. You know, one of the interesting people I interviewed for the book was a guy called Adam Tafler, who works with this idea of the wheel of consent, being able to look, you know, what are our gestures, recognizing that we're sexual beings. How do we give permission? How do we take? How do we receive? And doing that in a conscious way. But for sure, I think this is a huge black hole
mm,
in organizations, and we're scared to go there.
yeah.
But the consequences of of that fear are that we have environments where, you know, women are treated badly at work, where they are the subject to abuse, whether it's explicit or tacit. So I think this is a big area, and I think issues around sex, issues around power, issues around money, they're not really ambition. We're not anger. We're not really educated on them in organization.
No, and I think that's so sad. Let's explore power and strength, for example, because it might be easier to talk about than the sexual dynamic. Power is something, again, that as a society where we more often talk about it as power corrupts, for example, as we spoke about today. I've had really interesting conversations on this podcast that the most dangerous type of power is an unconscious relationship to power. So
Yes.
I've had, for example, people that has come from experiences in more the martial arts community, and they say that there's nothing as calm
Mm.
as an aura to be around people that has a very, very conscious relationship to their physical power. And I think the
Yes.
same is probably true for all of these kind of hidden shadows, that the danger is not being aware. It's not power in itself, right?
Yes. Yeah. I think you're right. We have negative associations with the word, whether it's anger, whether it's sex, whether it's
Mm,
power, and that's not helpful. I love the way you put it. That unconscious relationship is what's dangerous. I do boxing. I took it up in later life at 45 years old.
mm,
And I practiced now for 5 years, so but by far I'm not an expert. But I notice when I fight somebody who is a beginner, complete beginner, it's far more dangerous than fighting somebody who's conscious because they throw everything. They're not acting consciously. They're almost throwing and acting unconsciously. That becomes dangerous. So I think developing an awareness, developing a knowledge, developing familiarity can lead to more skillful means. But all of these things are also correlated, so the big Me Too movement and Harvey Weinstein,
mm,
he was famous for not just his the sexual misconduct, but also for his furious anger.
mm.
So some of the things can, and obviously power and abuse of power. So I wouldn't see these as separate dynamics. I would see them as also interconnected, and how might they be playing out in organization. That, don't forget, it's how did the organization allow him to excuse his behavior, sign NDAs, prevent people speaking out, attack whistleblowers, etc., that encouraged that. So again, we can look at our own relationship, and we need to look at the organization's
Yeah, and back to
tolerance.
your point around brains at work, I think it's such a simplistic way of looking at humans, right?
Yes.
I just maybe a fun point to not completely close out the sex chapter, but imagining a deeply sexually frustrated manager, like you
Yes.
can't really turn that off. Of course, it will impact your or somebody who is deeply angry and has no relationship to anger gives him or her zero ability to deal with that anger. And the idea of thinking that at work we're just logical and rational beings that can
Mm,
completely ignore all of the other facets of life. There's so much around like having clarity on your vision and mission and purpose that comes from cultivating a relationship to your own strength or whatever of the shadows it might be. That's for me is one of the kind of personal examples of the shadow work that I've done. I've been
mm,
really taught that power corrupts. There are
mm,
physical strength is something dangerous that should be masked. And the
mm,
consequence of that is just that I walked around in my life not having a relationship to it. And that's even
mm.
more dangerous because then I don't have
Yeah.
for example, productive outlet for strength, for example. Whereas today I
Yes.
do a meditation form that's called the dynamic meditation, which is
Mhm.
if you haven't done it and you walk into the room for the first time, you think it's like the loony room. People are screaming and throwing pillows and whatnot, but it's such a fantastic way to cultivate a conscious relationship to your strength.
So
I always get this kind of gorilla energy at the end of the meditation, and out of it,
yes.
I walk so much more calmer. That's
Yeah,
the consequence, and it's so interesting.
there's another meditation similar to the dynamic one that's almost like you express each emotion, like for a period of
Mm,
minutes, but totality. So, for example, you might express playfulness for a few minutes in your body, maybe with others socially. So it's more of a social mess. Then you might experience, let's say, tears and
yeah,
sorrow. Often we can't. Sadness doesn't have any place in organizations. We come
okay, yeah,
to your point around toxic positivity, we're performing. If someone asks us how we are, I'm fine. But expressing and being able to feel sadness, to cry, to belly, and then after you've expressed sadness, let's say totally for 5 minutes, then you notice the body goes into laughter and
yeah,
joy, and it might be that, and then you might be dancing in the sexual way.
mm,
In sexuality doesn't mean sex. Let's not
no,
confuse that. It's an energy that you can feel sensual, and you can allow yourself to feel that energy.
mm,
and then it might be anger, as you said, and then it might be love, and then it might be at the end, when you've gone through all the phases. I think there are 12 in this particular meditation I've done, used to do many times. At the end, your mind is still, and you can be present because you're not holding on. Now, for listeners of the podcast, this isn't something most of us do, obviously, in our everyday. But what it is attending to is, how far do we allow ourselves to experience the whole range of what it is to be human, at least to
Mm.
be safe to experience that in the right context. And that allows us, in developing our familiarity with our own anger, with our own playfulness, with our own, I think I showed the creator of the meditation dynamic one you mentioned. He said, unless you can be mad consciously, you'll become mad unconsciously. It was similar to Jung. He
Exactly.
said,
Yeah.
you make the unconscious conscious. We'll call
Mm.
it fate, and it will direct your life. So
Mm.
being able to develop a healthy relationship with it, with a range of emotions, makes us much more effective. Saint Irenaeus, his famous phrase was this: "The glory of God is a person, man, fully alive." And that full sense of aliveness, I think, is probably something we need as leaders, senior leaders, but
Mm.
something that can contribute not just to our world in the work of work, but throughout our different aspects of our lives.
100%. And I think there's I don't know if you agree with this, but I feel that there's a kind of blending in what's within psychology and personal development and different type of meditations and so forth. I feel that there's a lot of leaders that are a little bit afraid of even entering into that space. It feels like it's completely like it's too heavy lifting. I need to rebuild the whole foundation, and maybe you see the types of people that are mostly in these worlds have
Mm.
sometimes a tendency to almost turn away from the world of more professional pursuits, and you feel that no, that's not the life that I want. But you don't really see like what's the carrot, what's the reward for doing it. And it's almost impossible to with words the feeling of living more fully. But that's
Mm.
such a big reward.
Yeah.
I've been on this journey for 3 years, and as with anything that's kind of big and takes time, it was good that I didn't know how big a work it would be when I started out, but I could never
Yes.
imagine not doing it. And it's not
Yes.
something at all that I've ever felt during this period of time that I regret starting this journey, and just having the ability to, over time, live more and more presently and fully alive in the world that I inhabit is such a gift for me, at least. So
Yeah.
working with
Well,
shadows is just one part of it, but it's such a rewarding pursuit, let's say.
yeah, I do wonder about this, and I think this is generational as well, Johan. Like, I've read that in the past, people didn't expect as much from their work. Work was something they did
Mm,
for a portion of their day, and then they spent time with family, as time with friends, doing other things.
mm.
And over the decades, the expectations that we have of work have changed. Now
Yeah, and I
we
also think the quality of the life outside of work has gone down. We see a lot around, again, coming back to sex, we have less and less sex, and you talk about that it's dopamine is so freely available on the mobile phone or on the Netflix or whatever. So just the quality of friendships are going down over time. So like the
yeah.
balancing forces are also less balancing in a sense.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think this is probably we're in a society that encourages shadow behavior,
Yeah.
performative leadership, maybe distracted leadership, maybe, hollow, brand me leadership.
Mm.
So in a way, this is a call to deeper work and to rediscovering, okay, how, given this is the conditions we're in, how do we lead from that place rather than ignoring it? So part of my work was this concept of leading from the dark,
Mm.
and the idea of not ignoring, as you said, the times we're living in and the pressures and the forces, but how do we use that almost like a container to lead from, and to take as a productive, almost like crucible for transformation.
Can you
But
share an example of what leading from the dark actually means? Maybe through somebody you've worked with or something like that?
one a simple example is our relationship to the unknown, and darkness is often a metaphor for the unknown,
Mm,
and often we conflate the unknown with uncertainty. So we can read hundreds of books about leading from uncertainty, but uncertainty is only one feeling in response to the unknown. So think about children at their birthdays or Christmas or Eid or Diwali. There's a gift that's wrapped. They
mm,
don't know what's in, but the child doesn't feel uncertain. They may feel curious. They may feel full of wonder, possibility, excitement. So the question I have then is, how do we turn this space of the unknown, not as a space of or place of uncertainty, but as a space of opportunity.
mm,
And what I discovered was that it's not about adding more tools to the leader's toolkit, but there's a phrase that came from a poet called John Keats, and the phrase was negative capability. And he used it in a letter to his brothers George and Thomas in 1817, and he described negative capability as the ability to be with mystery, uncertainty, and doubt without
mm,
irritable to fact and reason. He was comparing Shakespeare and Coleridge. Coleridge was, rational, played by the numbers. Shakespeare was more wild, organic, in the moment, humorous. And much of our challenges today, require us to be with mystery
mm.
because we don't know. The world is more incomprehensible. More information doesn't make it more comprehensible. We then need to interpret it. The world is much more anxious. So our ability to be with these, let's say, unknown or darker, is a capacity that I think we need as leaders. So that's
What are
a
more
simple.
example of negative capacities in the context of leadership, do you think? So
Yeah. So
uncertainty is one.
simple example is like practices. For example, pausing. It's a very common thing now to continue and not to take a pause or to see a pause as a break, but not necessarily in a positive way. We're going to pause now and then we're going to. But pausing is extremely effective. I'll give a simple example. So imagine a very competitive game of basketball. Teams are doing well, but there is no breakthrough. A coach can call a timeout. It could
Mm,
be 1 minute, and yet it can change the whole direction of play. And often when we're in meetings, there's a phrase called the frenzied manager. We can almost be relentless and busy, and we're rewarded for business as a badge of honor. But
mm.
being able to frequently pause is a negative capability that allows us to be more effective. And by negative capability, I don't mean something negative is in our popular understanding of negative,
No,
but I
absolutely.
mean
Yeah.
hidden or under not privileged, underutilized.
Mm,
So, it's like focusing on the words or the speaker rather than the listener. I love that. I have a friend who's a conductor, and he wrote a book called The Ignorant Maestro. His name is Itai Talgam, and his talk is called Keynote Listening because it said it's the listening of the audience that makes a performance, not necessarily the orchestra.
mm,
So it's interesting. The negative capabilities are things like silence. They're things like not doing. They're things like solitude. They're things like pausing. They're things like surrender. Things that we don't normally associate as having value in the
mm,
business world. What I did with my co-author Diana Kuyan, we looked at negative capabilities for doing, negative capabilities for being, negative capabilities for knowing, because in leadership we tend to privilege one aspect and ignore or underutilize the other.
mm.
That leaves us a bit of balance. We privilege knowledge rather than curiosity. We privilege activity rather than the stillness that activity can proceed from. Or we privilege, let's say, narrow definitions of success rather than our interconnectedness and reliance with each other or the wider natural world. So, what I wanted to do in the Shadow book is really a culmination of that is recognizing the impact of what we tend to focus on only on what's seen and what is the impact of what we're not aware of individually and collectively, to make us better leaders and to help us build and lead better organizations.
I wonder how much of this will change as a consequence of meditation becoming more and more mainstream as a tool for high performance. So one of the things in pausing, silence, if you're the busy manager, let's say, one of the things that you lose is clarity a lot because you don't, for yourself or for your team, allow these moments of reflection, taking a little bit of a step back from the operational whirlwind. Um, but as more and more managers are kind of discovering meditation, I wonder if we are seeing the beginning of a trend in another direction. What do you think?
Yeah.
Do you see the same, that it's increasing, these types of practices, or am I living in a small bubble here?
No, I've seen a rise of, mindfulness the last 10 years and, lots of good work there because it does raise awareness. But then, there's also criticism of this movement. It's almost like a Jim Coronel Purser wrote a book called Mac Mindfulness, where, it's almost become like the commodification and the co-optedness of meditation, mindfulness by corporations. We can help people reduce their stress, but let's not reduce their working hours. Let's
Mm.
not change any
Yeah,
systemic.
it's a coping mechanism.
Yes, and it can be used as a mechanism for almost like getting more productivity
Mm,
as a rather than necessarily helping an individual and changing. It's like in Gestalt, it's like helping somebody get used to a dark room without helping them open, the window thing and letting the natural light in. So I think it can be helpful, but there are many good, great thinkers and leaders who don't meditate. I think of great thinkers like Adam Grant. He says, it's not for him, but people find their way in different activities. Your way might be through dance. Another person's is through walking or hiking. And my friend does it through bodybuilding, let's say. But when he's doing that, he doesn't necessarily listen to music, but he's really aware about what he's doing. It allows him to
mm,
connect to the person and he's in the activity in itself. So I think rather than labeling, there's a tendency to label some activities as spiritual, some as not spiritual, some as meditation, some as not. I think it's more the quality of awareness, no matter what you're
yeah,
doing, whether it's
exactly.
walk.
I heard the definition at a retreat I was at, speaking about the exact same thing. That was meditation is anything that you do with your full intensity. And I think for
Yeah.
me something kind of clicked there. So if
Mm,
you give the example of walking as meditation, I wouldn't say that just walking my kids to school and then hurrying to my job is meditative at all. But being out in the woods without something in my ears can be very meditative. If I just take myself as an example, before I
mm,
had any type of meditative practice, my only form of meditation was really, can I distract myself so much so that the thoughts are quiet? So that for
mm,
me meant like playing video games while watching a movie, for example, because I was so engaged, right? So that was the only kind of relaxation for my mind. And then you
mm,
grow a little bit more comfortable over time with your thoughts in the more quiet meditations.
mm,
Um, so I think my only message as we kind of discuss anything can be meditation, it's also
mm.
very easy to give yourself permission to just be distracted. And that to me it doesn't serve the message in a sense.
I see that, but I also think, distraction is a part of meditation. And, it's
Yeah, sure.
not something, it's not, we don't have a clear mind. We're not
Mm,
like a tranquil lake all the time. And
mm,
that the process of being aware, okay, I'm distracted and coming back, that
mm.
equally is meditation.
Uh,
And I think we put too many almost like pressures on ourselves to be able to so-called meditate or do things right,
mm,
that we quickly stop because we feel that we aren't doing it right.
mm,
So, in a way, it's not what you're doing, but how you're doing. So there's a famous phrase, before enlightenment, I chop wood, carry water. After
yeah.
enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. And the meaning is, it's not in the activity in itself. It's in, your spirit while doing the activity. But what I would say is take the pressure off as listeners to find, to do things in a particular way. Find activities that you feel a sense of flow, sense of
Mm,
engagement, a sense of awareness, a sense of joy, and think about how do you, what does that bring you, and how can you build more of that into your day,
Mm.
no matter how small. One of the things I did with pausing, I remember saying to my coach or therapist at the time, I was exhausted and I was burned out. And he said, "Why don't you take a vacation?" I said, "I don't have time to take a vacation."
Mm.
He said, "I don't mean take one in the future. I mean now." I said, "What?" He said, "Why don't you take a 30-second vacation?" And he got me to put down what I was holding, put my hands behind my head, lean back in the chair, put my feet out, even on the desk, and take a rest for 30 seconds.
Yeah.
And I tell you, and I invite listeners to try this, but equally, just with 30 seconds, I felt refreshed. I felt a bit renewed. And even though it was such a small moment of time, so, what I say is meditation isn't something separate, like that you have to necessarily put time. It can be something that you can integrate and use in your day. But
It's very
alongside,
threatening when you're in that kind of mindset of I have to get this done, and then there's time pressures and so forth, to just sit down in a chair without nothing for 3 minutes. It's almost like deeply like, this feels wrong, because I completely share the same experience of the impact that can have in
mm,
getting clarity on what I need to do in order to complete the task that is stressing me out. So the 3 minutes might save 4 hours in practice just because you got more clarity, right? But the
mm,
act of sitting down in that chair when you're in that state is very feels very dangerous almost.
yeah, it's not normative. You're right. Up to stopping, waiting, etc. But I think these are the negative capabilities that I think are really helpful to develop. Again, it's not privileging one or the other. It's coming back to your point about balance. Now,
Yeah.
one of the exercises I do in not knowing is I get people to think of a complex challenge they're facing at work, for example, and I give them a yellow piece of paper. And they give them 2 minutes to write down all the facts about the challenge, all the things they know. Music is playing. Then I ask them, fold it in half again, and put it into their right pocket. Then I give them a blue piece of paper, the same challenge, same length of time, 2 minutes, but this time to write down all the things that they don't know, all the
Mm.
questions they have, all the curiosities. Fold it in half again, put it into your pocket. Now, at the end, take the two pieces of paper in each hand. Which feels the lighter metaphorically, which the heavier? Which list was the longer? Which was the shorter? Which was the easy? Which was the harder? Now, each of them has a different experience, but what I normally say is, I didn't tell you to take what you know and throw it away. No, I wasn't saying that you're the tabula rasa. What I'm saying is keep it in your pocket. So hold what you know, but
Mm.
also make space for what you don't know.
Yeah.
And what we tend to do in organizations over-index on one or the other. We either rest what we know, and we don't give enough time for our curiosity
Mm.
and are not, or we think we don't know anything and we forget what we do know. So I think, part of this ability to work with shadow is recognizing, what are we aware of, what aren't we aware of, and being able to wrestle with both. And questions and curiosity, I think, are a key capability of that.
Yeah, curiosity is such an interesting trait and skill, especially now in an environment that is changing so quickly. I strongly believe that curious leaders will be high performing leaders in the coming years, treating
Yeah.
uncertainty not as risk but as opportunities comes very close, in terms of mindset, being more curious. So I would love to hear more about, because the example that you just gave is a tool for encouraging curiosity in teams. What are more tools that you
The other
use
is,
to encourage curiosity?
I think, ask more questions. As a child, if a child, we're always asking questions. Why,
Mm.
what, how. You'll be familiar with this with your young children, but then at school, if a child asks more than two or three questions in a class, they're thought to have ADHD, and then they put
They get
medication.
penalized quite
Well,
clearly. I've read studies around this that teachers say that they want curious children, but in reality they treat them worse and worse the more questions that they ask.
Yeah, it's almost like seen as attention or, we're not rewarded. And so as adults, we learn to stop asking
Mm.
questions and we don't ask enough questions or we don't, we only stay within our narrow frames. So
It's
part
also
of
the
practice,
style of question. I had a guy on the podcast as well who wrote a book about curiosity, and he said that I think it was 80 something percent of questions are not really curious question. There are trying to confirm a bias. So it's
yes.
not open-ended questions. So the style of questions that we ask in organizations is really important as well.
Yeah, in a practice called adaptive leadership, one of their practices is to ask conflictual questions.
Uh,
So, meaning questions that are more difficult to ask. So, rather than oh, that's great. How did you do? It's
mm,
more the question is, what part did you play in the mess?
mm.
How did you contribute to this problem? So that's a difficult question, but the more conflictual questions we can ask helps open up our thinking as well. So I think there's huge power leaders can play in asking better and more questions and
But it's also
conflictual questions.
difficult to do this in a management team, let's say, or in a team, because questions that are important, they also take time. So it's a balance, and it can be kind of annoying at times having a team member that is the question asker, right? When you just want to get shit done. So
Yeah,
it's
you can make time for this. So
yeah.
I worked with an organization that they ran coaching circles, which would just focus on questions, and they were with people who are not in your area. So if you tend to have people who have, they work in your department, they tend to see problems through the same frame as you, and therefore have tending to see solutions
Mm,
and ask questions around the same angle. The way this works is that people from different departments would get together once a week for 30 minutes only, and each person would have a challenge they're facing, and they had to speak the challenge, but then they would remain silent. And then each other person, let's say there were four or five in the group, they would ask an open question to that person. That person didn't have to answer. Their job was just to listen and write down the question. Because
mhm.
often we want to give a quick reply, yes, but
Yeah,
I've tried
that's
this,
a good
blah, blah.
point. Yeah.
And they were questions like, "Where have you seen this before?"
Mm,
"No, what else have you tried? Who should be involved?" But they weren't questions that were no yes or no. They were open, and they led to more inquiry. And at the end, the person could share, what did they learn from being receiving all of those questions.
mm.
So I think there's a practical way that's really helpful to help leaders work with questions and leverage on the power of people who are
And it
not
connects
necessarily.
kind of to the shadows as well, because the shadows
Mm,
are a lot of times the unknowns, right? And the
mm,
questions are also about uncovering the unknowns. I think so much of bad
mm.
choices that I've made in my career has actually been due to confirmation bias. That I thought I knew things that it turned out I didn't know.
Yeah, I agree. And there's also this idea that, we always seem to want to answer and solve questions,
Mm,
but children don't ask questions for information. I mean, they ask questions for discovery.
mm,
To your point around confirmation or curiosity. So there's a concept called the beautiful question, and it's by a poet who works a lot with corporations called David White. And he said often beautiful questions are questions that you can ask yourself that don't require immediate answers, but that the answer to those questions evolve, over your life and over
mm.
your career. But they're deeper questions, such as, what's my purpose? You don't answer that once and forever.
No.
That's a question that you re-engage in. What's my leadership style? What are my strengths? What these are questions that you can go deeper and deeper as your maturity rises, as your tenure rises, as your experience grows. But we keep on asking with a freshness and an aliveness these questions. The poet Rilke, he wrote a lovely phrase about learning to love the questions themselves as if they were treasures locked in
Mm,
a room. And part of this is falling in love with the question
yeah.
and not necessarily trying to think about question solution.
Mm,
That's that easy fallacy, I think. rather than the beauty of good questions that open up new insights, fresh thinking, rather than just provide ready-made answers or solutions.
Yeah, I completely agree. I had a pretty powerful experience over the summer where I actually wrote down a lot of my desires as a way of kind of excavating them. I thought it was very difficult to deal with them just in the abstract, just in the process of a meditation or something like that. I found it was too much taboo and shame around them, so I wanted to have a process where I wrote them out to kind of excavate them, and then in the step two, think about how are these either supporting my vision in life, or are these things that I actually don't want to do, even though they're there. And part of that was exactly this. One of the things that I became very much aware of that I try to optimize my life towards, and the podcast is just one example, is how curiosity is something that I want as a at least weekly, but almost daily practice. It's a value in itself, and I think as I've grown older, I've started experiencing that the choices that I made early on in life, they were so binary in terms of you talked about security or prestige or financials. Uh, but as you kind of excavate a broader map of desires, you can start optimizing for things that aren't difficult in the same sense
Mm,
to achieve. So optimizing a life for curiosity, for example, it's not very
mm,
difficult to achieve, but it gives me tremendous value. And I wrote about the same thing when it came to my children. That one of the things that I want them to get from me is
mm.
curiosity as the highest form of pleasure, right? Because that's to me is it's always been the case, and that's one of the hallmarks of my fatherhood that I want to give on and pass on, and it gives me a lot of pleasure.
Yes, and hopefully they're teaching it to you as well by their,
Yeah,
by their questions and
yeah.
their curiosity. In Zen, there's a phrase. It says, "In the beginner's mind, many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few." And I think that's worth bearing in mind. Is how do we keep that beginner's mind? Again, back to my example, not throwing away what you know, but
Mm,
making space you don't, by asking more questions, by
mm,
seeking conflict ideas, by maybe mentoring, being or reverse mentoring with somebody
mm,
who's junior to you but is an expert in something you know nothing about. I
mm,
remember going to a conference. It was by Wired Technology magazine, and I met a guy there who worked in. I asked him, "What's your business?" He said, "I work in garden centers."
mm,
And I said, "What are you doing in a technology conference?" He said, "Every year I go to two or three conferences in an area that is totally unrelated to my business. So what
mhm.
can I learn?" No, so it's that kind of mindset, I think, that would keeps us fresh, keeps us alive, and
Yeah.
makes us effective as leaders.
I would
I
want,
think.
before we end out the podcast, to explore a little bit more about the spiritual lens and how you've come to think about, like, some other concepts that we don't, especially in the Western world, have a pretty conscious relationship to, is ideas of like destiny, purpose. We like to frame it more as, if we have a conscious relationship to, we more frame it more as perhaps vision, where I'm the agent in this journey. Have you worked or thought about those concepts like destiny and so forth?
Yes, there are many ways of thinking that. One is, life happens to you.
Yeah.
The other perspective is life happens through you. And then another one is life happens as you. So rather than, and I think that's, the evolution's almost in thinking about your relationship to life. One obviously at the victim, one as the vehicle instrument, and then one as you can't separate yourself from life. It is you. In my own journey, it was initially I did the transpersonal path, looking at, but then I discovered, it was more for me the interpersonal. So I studied relational psychology, Gestalt, etc. And my definition of spirituality changed. It didn't become something that was separate from life. but rather my view was I grow in my spirituality by growing in my humanity.
Mm.
And I think, for leaders and being able to attend to our own humanity, our own sense of grief, our own sense of sadness, our own lust, ambition, jealousy, all of these human capabilities, I think, makes us more whole.
Mm.
And so my work is around supporting that conversation, not having a divide between this is spiritual, this is material, but thinking what would be the bridge so that it makes sense,
Mm.
and there's almost nothing to reject. So I'm hoping that from our conversation, listeners walk away with an appreciation of the shadow, an appreciation of negative capabilities,
Mm.
and how it might support them in their work and also in their broader lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was the quote that you started the podcast with? I thought it was so beautiful. I would want to end the podcast on the same.
Sure. So the quote was by Sir Michael Tippett, and it is, "I would know my shadow and my light, so would I at last be whole."
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Stephen, for coming on.
Yeah, thank you, and it's my pleasure.
And there, we're at the end of the episode. I think it's so amazing that almost 70% of you actually listen to the end of the episodes, especially for long format. I'm so thankful for that. Like, the engagement numbers is fantastic. Before we leave each other, two things. First off, this episode was sponsored by Grail, and I'll make no secret about it. Grail is the company that I'm starting. So it's the future of AI, and how can we unlock value that's not just automation, but actually building towards a future that we want to live in, like a future where I want to work, augmentation. So head over to grail.works to know more. Secondly, I'd appreciate so much that you listen to this podcast. But even though 70% listen to the end, almost 70% are not subscribed either. So if you can give a like button, subscribe to all my channels. We're on LinkedIn, we're on Instagram, we're on TikTok apparently. We have an awesome webpage. And there's so much more content. Like, yes, the reels and so forth. But what I really would like to push for is that every week I publish a long format article, which is the pinnacle of my thinking. So it's the most interesting thing that I come across that week, either in podcasts or in other endeavors. And I try to write about it towards you, a senior leader. Like, what is the crucial takeaway from the most important part of my week, let's say. I publish that on LinkedIn and on my webpage, thinkroompodcast.com. Thank you so much, and see you next time.